Have you ever wondered what D-Day looked like from the other side of the beach? The German perspective on June 6, 1944, is a story of miscalculation, confusion, and overwhelming force. Let's dive into how the longest day unfolded for the soldiers in the Atlantic Wall. By the spring of 1944, the German High Command knew an Allied invasion was coming. The question wasn't if, but where. Many, including the celebrated Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, believed the primary target would be the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest sea route from Britain. Normandy was considered a secondary possibility. This fundamental disagreement shaped German strategy. Rommel, in charge of defending the coast, wanted his panzer divisions positioned right at the beaches, ready to smash any landing force before it could establish a foothold. He famously said the first 24 hours would be decisive. However, his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, and others, argued for holding the tanks further inland as a central reserve. This would allow them to counterattack wherever the main invasion force landed, avoiding being pinned down by naval guns. This dispute meant that on the crucial day, the panzers were scattered and required Hitler's personal approval to move, a fatal delay. Adding to this strategic uncertainty was the state of Germany's military. The brutal war on the Eastern Front had bled the Wehrmacht dry. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, was now locked in a desperate struggle against the Soviets and defending the Reich from Allied bombing raids. This left the Atlantic coast practically naked. German pilots were scarce, and the few planes available were no match for the thousands of Allied aircraft that would soon dominate the skies over Normandy. The once mighty German war machine was sputtering. Now, let's look at the men tasked with defending thousands of miles of coastline. The divisions guarding the Atlantic Wall were a shadow of the elite forces that had stormed across Europe in 1940. Many units were static, meaning they had no transport and were expected to fight and die where they stood. These were often filled with soldiers deemed unfit for the Eastern Front, men recovering from serious wounds, older reservists, and a significant number of non-Germans. These so-called Osttroppen or Eastern troops were conscripted prisoners of war from Poland, Georgia, and other Soviet republics. Their loyalty and motivation were, understandably, questionable. Many were malnourished and ill-equipped, a far cry from the propaganda image of the invincible German soldier. For example, the 709th Infantry Division defending Utah Beach had a large contingent of Georgian and Polish conscripts. These men were manning the defenses, but their will to fight for the Third Reich was brittle at best. As the Allies finalized their plans, a critical lack of leadership plagued the German side. On the very day the invasion began, Field Marshal Rommel, the man most obsessed with the coastal defenses, was away. He had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday on June 6 and planned to meet with Hitler to plead for more resources and control of the panzer divisions. He was convinced the bad weather would prevent any landing attempts for at least a few weeks. Meanwhile, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, was asleep when the first reports came in. Woken in the early hours, he dismissed the initial paratrooper landings as a diversion, a feint to draw attention away from the real invasion he still expected at Pas-de-Calais. This crucial misinterpretation meant that the initial response was slow and uncoordinated. The top commanders were literally and figuratively absent when the storm broke. Despite their shortcomings, the Germans had prepared formidable defenses, especially under Rommel's direction. Beaches like Utah were lined with obstacles. Concrete gun emplacements, known as casemates, housed artillery pieces aimed at the sea. The sands were seeded with mines and Rommel's asparagus, angled wooden poles designed to rip open landing craft. Barbed wire fences stretched for miles, and the low-lying fields behind the beaches were intentionally flooded, creating treacherous swamps to trap paratroopers and slow any advance inland. The Germans had turned the coastline into a deadly gauntlet. They were hoping to make the price of landing so high that the Allies would be thrown back into the sea. The Allied assault began with a terrifying roar in the dead of night on June 5. Heavy bombers pounded coastal batteries and infrastructure. Then, the sky filled with paratroopers. For the German soldiers on the ground, it was chaos. Reports flooded in of enemy troops landing everywhere. At dawn on June 6, the true scale of the invasion became terrifyingly clear. As the morning mist lifted, German soldiers peered out from their bunkers to see a sight that defied belief. The horizon was completely filled with ships. Over 5,000 vessels, from massive battleships to tiny landing craft, formed an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen. Then came the naval bombardment. Shells the size of cars rained down, shaking the very earth and turning concrete bunkers into dust. For many young or inexperienced German soldiers, the psychological impact was devastating. They were isolated, deafened by the explosions, and completely cut off from their command. The feeling of being utterly, hopelessly alone against an unstoppable force began to set in. Despite the shock and the overwhelming odds, many German units fought back with grim determination. At strong points like the one designated Widerstandsnest 5 near Utah Beach, German soldiers manned their machine guns and mortar, pouring fire onto the landing Americans. They were trained to hold their positions at all costs, and with minimal air support and dwindling ammunition, they did just as they were told. The fighting was intense and personal, but bravery alone couldn't stop the tide. The Allies brought not just numbers, but devastating new weapons. Flamethrower tanks, known as crocodiles, spewed liquid fire into bunkers, while artillery fired white phosphorus shells that created horrific burns and suffocating smoke. By late morning on June 6, one by one, the German defensive positions on the beaches began to collapse under this relentless assault. The combination of naval gunfire, aerial bombing, and overwhelming infantry numbers, armed with fearsome technology, proved too much. The experience varied across the different landing zones. At Omaha Beach, the well-positioned German 352nd Infantry Division inflicted horrific casualties on the American forces, nearly thwarting the landing altogether. But at beaches like Utah, the preliminary bombardment had been more effective, and the American troops landed in a less heavily defended area, allowing them to push inland relatively quickly. But everywhere, the story ended the same way. German units, fighting in isolation, were eventually surrounded and overwhelmed. The sheer number of Allied soldiers hitting the beaches was something the defenders simply could not cope with. The German High Command, still miles away and operating on faulty intelligence, struggled to grasp the situation. Hitler himself, when he was finally awakened late in the morning, remained confident. He reportedly dismissed the news, believing the invasion was exactly the opportunity they needed to crush the Allies on the coast. He and his generals fundamentally underestimated the Allies' numerical and material superiority. They were still fighting a war of 1940, while the Allies were waging a war of 1944, a war of overwhelming industrial might. The successful Allied landings on D-Day didn't win the war in a single day, but they created a permanent beachhead in Western Europe. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. For the German soldiers who survived the initial onslaught, it was the beginning of a long, brutal retreat across France. For the Nazi regime, it was the beginning of the end. The two-front war they had long feared was now a reality, and the path to Berlin was open. The German perspective on D-Day is a stark reminder that even the most determined defense can crumble in the face of overwhelming force, strategic miscalculation, and a leadership completely detached from reality. Thank you for watching. If you found this perspective on history interesting, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. See you next time.